What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran. I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. And today we're going to be taking a look at humanitarian aid coming into Venezuela. All right, Alexander, I'm going to say humanitarian aid, and I'll put quotes around that humanitarian aid. Venezuela does accept humanitarian aid. From the Red Cross, from the UN, from Russia, from China. They do accept humanitarian aid. They have accepted humanitarian aid in the past. But this specific humanitarian aid coming across the Colombian border into Venezuela is causing a lot of problems. And it's, as you predicted in a video we did a couple of days ago, you said that the Plan B option of Bolton and Abrams and these guys was to use U.S. humanitarian aid as a type of Trojan horse to justify the regime change and possible, and I say possible, military action or some sort of Syria-style rebel incursion or something along those lines that could happen. Now, your prediction has come true, I believe, in a way, because that humanitarian aid is really ramping up the crisis in Venezuela, or at least to us, watching from the outside looking in, appears to be ramping up the crisis in Venezuela. What's going on, Alexander?
So let's first of all begin with some of the points you've made, which are absolutely correct. About this being humanitarian aid, about Venezuela accepting legitimate humanitarian aid from legitimate humanitarian agencies. It is very important to make clear that this humanitarian aid that we've been hearing about, that they've been trying to deliver or say they've been trying to deliver to Venezuela, is not being provided through these humanitarian agencies like the Red Cross. The Red Cross has made it absolutely clear that it has no part in this operation, which it sees as wholly political, and it has complained, apparently, about the fact that some of the people involved in this operation used, or to be more correct, misused the Red Cross symbol as part of their attempt to provide this aid. Now, what this was, in my opinion, a classic color revolution, regime change operation, which we saw on the Venezuelan borders with Colombia and Brazil. So there's talk about providing humanitarian aid. It's not really humanitarian aid in any sufficient quantities to make any difference to Venezuela. And of course, it's not being provided in cooperation with the legitimate, legal, internationally recognized Venezuelan authorities who represent Venezuela in international organizations like the United Nations. It was an attempt to provide aid, so-called aid, to Guaido and the group that has declared itself the government of Venezuela with US support, and to do so in such a way as to undermine the authority of the legitimate Venezuelan authorities. And the way this operation was conducted demonstrates this. Firstly, we have a fake Live Aid concert. I have to say fake because, to my mind, this whole operation was fake. Performed in Colombia, laid on by Richard Branson. Guaido himself was there. Apparently, not so many people turned up. It was expected that 250,000 people would turn up. Estimates range between 3,000 and 20,000. And then there was these attempts to send this aid across the border into Venezuela along the roadways, along the roads in Venezuela. They were these trucks with aid from Colombia and Brazil, aid provided by the US government, were prevented from entering Venezuela by the Venezuelan military. There seem to have been some riots. It doesn't seem, by Venezuelan standards, as this was anything on any particularly big scale. At some point, some of these trucks, perhaps one, perhaps more, were set on fire. There is a great deal of dispute about who set them on fire. And, of course, there were also reports which I would take with a great amount of caution that some Venezuelan troops defected. I say great caution because reports vary between 4 and 60, and so far we haven't seen any of these people who've defected coming along, giving interviews, doing all the sort of things you would expect that they would do, especially if there were as many as 60 of them. This is intended to show that the Venezuelan authorities have lost control of the country's borders and to send the food into Venezuela in a way that would undermine their position as a legitimate authority. That failed. And to the extent that it was intended to provoke mass defections of the Venezuelan military, that failed also. But in one respect, it did succeed in that, as I said, it created a nice show for the cameras, and Guaido is now taking that show for the cameras with him to this summit that's going to happen in Lima. He's going to push this narrative that the Venezuelan authorities are preventing humanitarian aid entering the country, and are therefore waging war, an economic war against the Venezuelan people. And already he's busy tweeting and sending out messages that he wants the United States to intervene more actively in Venezuela than it already is. And I think the talk now is of further sanctions against Venezuela, a tightening of the blockade against Venezuela, all done on the pretext of these staged events on Venezuela's borders.
All right. Wow. We have a lot to cover then. You are right. Pompeo has announced, I think he announced it on CNN or Fox News, that they are going to tighten the sanctions on Venezuela. He announced that. He also said that, the U.S. is fighting for the Venezuelan people to liberate themselves. And he once again called on military personnel, the military leaders, to defect over to the Guaido camp. So Pompeo already started out this Sunday morning, making the rounds on all the media channels, spewing out this propaganda. And what has become an information war, I have a lot of questions to ask you, Alexander, which I want you to clarify for our viewers. Clarify a little bit more in depth, real quick, the humanitarian aid, the concept of using humanitarian aid to destabilize Venezuela. I think everyone understood what you were saying, but I want to try to get it to even a more simpler approach to make it clear that this humanitarian aid, they may have arms, they may have guns, but that may not be the real reason that they're using this humanitarian aid as a staged attempt to destabilize Maduro. From what I understand, the real reason is the humanitarian aid undermines the authority of the government, while at the same time building up the crisis and amplifying the apparent crisis of Venezuela. Is that correct?
You've got it right. Now, let's take it step by step. Firstly, sending a humanitarian aid like this into Venezuela against the wishes of the Venezuelan government and providing it to a parallel so-called government that is not the Venezuelan government, but which pretends it is, signals to the Venezuelan people that power is shifting away from the legitimate government of the country to this parallel government, which now has control of supplies of food and medicines, which it can distribute to the population in competition with the Venezuelan government. And of course, if this humanitarian aid is then supplied across the borders against the wishes of the Venezuelan government, it undermines the Venezuelan government's claim to control the country, because a key part of control of the country is control of the country's borders. So it had that purpose. It had the purpose of undermining the legitimacy and authority of the Venezuelan government, authority of Guaido and his group, but it also had other purposes too. The other purpose that it served was to make the Venezuelan government look bad. Pompeo and Bolton and all of these people are now in a position to say that because the Venezuelan authorities have prevented humanitarian aid entering Venezuela, they are deliberately, that is to say, the Venezuelan authorities are deliberately aggravating the economic and humanitarian crisis within Venezuela itself. So it puts the Venezuelan authorities in a bad light by making it seem that they are indifferent to the plight of their own people. And the third objective in this episode is what we said, and again what you touched on, but what I said at the beginning about putting on a show for the cameras. You have people protesting. We don't know exactly who these people are, but we have films of people protesting, of the riot police in action, of tear gas being fired. Once again, it reinforces the image of the Venezuelan authorities clamping down upon the Venezuelan people who supposedly they no longer represent. So that's what Pompeo is now saying, and it was entirely predictable, and it was how this thing was supposed to be staged. The reason it was staged like that right from the start, and you're absolutely right, by staging this show, you increase the sense of crisis. You increase the sense that there is a humanitarian crisis within Venezuela, which the Venezuelan government, instead of combating, is supposedly making worse. And you increase the sense of crisis by creating this image of the Venezuelan authorities violently repressing their own people.
Yeah, you manufacture consent within the United States and throughout Europe that, Venezuela is on fire, that Maduro is starving the people of food. He's prohibiting medicines to get into the country. Look at all the good that the United States is doing by trying to send aid into the country. Look at this good guy, Guaido, who wants the aid to come in so he could save the people. And everyone in the U.S. starts freaking out and starts saying, oh my God, Maduro, dictator thug. I heard that this morning on one of the Fox shows. Maduro, the dictator thug, is stopping the humanitarian aid that we're sending from entering the country to help the Venezuelan people. That was pretty much word for word what the narrative was on Fox, what the newscaster on Fox said. So you are manufacturing consent for another humanitarian intervention and another humanitarian regime change. And as you said in the opening of the show, Alexander, it is working. You have globalists like Sir Richard Branson who are getting on board to help manufacture this consent and to help push for a regime change in Venezuela. Why is Richard Branson getting on board and doing this? Explain to our viewers why he's doing this. And you also have a man who announced he's going to be running for the presidency in 2020, Bernie Sanders, who has also said that he is against Maduro stopping the humanitarian aid from entering the country. You have on the left, whether it's progressives like Bernie Sanders or neocons like John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, all support the regime change in Venezuela and consider it a humanitarian crisis. Why is this happening, Alexander?
Well, because exactly what, can I just add about Richard Branson? I mean, the important thing to say about Richard Branson is that, of course, he is a British neoliberal interventionist. He is very much of the same sort of outlook as Tony Blair was, who also, of course, supported all the humanitarian interventionist wars. And you see him now embracing this thing in a big way. And in the case of Branson, who is, as I said, British, I suspect there's also some desire here to embarrass Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party, who's known to be against these humanitarian so-called interventionist wars, and who has spoken out already against this humanitarian regime that comes in. But, you summed it up perfectly. I was hoping you were going to mention Bernie Sanders, because for me, Bernie Sanders really encapsulates the whole problem. You have people once again being persuaded by a narrative. It is not the truth any more than weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were the truth. That was not the reason why they invaded Iraq. And it is not the reason that they're trying to carry out regime change in Venezuela, that there is an economic and humanitarian crisis there. They are actually escalating the crisis in Venezuela. And I have been very critical of Maduro, more, I think, than some of our viewers like. But I come back to this. He is not a dictator. There is no sense in which he is a dictator. If he had been a dictator, Guaido would have been arrested by now, and so would other people who support him. Now, why is this happening? Well, partly it is because, of course, there has been a very powerful impulse in the West for some time, going all the way back to the end of the Cold War, to carry out regime change in governments which the people in Washington, the neo-globalists, don't particularly like. And Venezuela is one. Secondly, of course, Venezuela has lots of oil, and that's always an issue that concerns them too. Thirdly, Venezuela has been aligning to an increasing degree with China and Russia. And of course, many people in the US are unhappy with that because they regard Latin America as their neighborhood and they don't want the Russians and the Chinese encroaching there. But last but not least, there is, of course, the particular drive of certain members of the Trump administration, namely Bolton and Pompeo, to reassert American power after the geopolitical defeats the United States has suffered in Syria, is increasingly suffering in Afghanistan, and is gradually increasingly going to suffer in Ukraine also. So there are lots of various factors at play, but the fact is Venezuela is in their sights, and this is a project around which the entire political class of the United States is, as you rightly say, united. I think of the important people in the United States, I don't know how important she really is, but of the people in the United States that I know of, only Tulsi Gabbard has to some extent spoken out against it, and it's hardly an important issue even for her.
Yeah, shame on Bernie Sanders for supporting the regime change.
Absolutely.
It just goes to show how spineless. I always said that Bernie Sanders was spineless the minute he was cheated out of the election, out of the primary that he should have won, and instead of forming his own party and rebelling against his own party, like a man, he decided to kiss up to Hillary, 100% support Hillary Clinton, like a good foot soldier.
Absolutely. I think that this episode with Venezuela should put this idea that Bernie Sanders is any real change in the United States finally to sleep. He isn't. That's not what he's about at all, it seems to me. He talks a certain talk on certain issues, but when it comes down to it, he doesn't represent any sort of change at all. I think that's become completely clear now.
Yeah, he is controlled by the forces that be 100%. If not, he is controlled opposition. He's a controlled clown. But absolutely. Now you mentioned Syria, and of course we had the narrative of moderate rebels, and Assad gasses his own people. So that's why the U.S. had to intervene in Syria, right? That was a false narrative as well. Many false flags. One of the Venezuelan military officials has said that the fire set on these humanitarian convoys was actually a false flag started by the United States. Could this be a possibility?
Absolutely. I think it's entirely possible. I mean, I don't know that it was, and I want to make it very clear. I wasn't there. I don't know that it was. But it would be entirely in character with this sort of thing. We are in the middle of an information war. Whilst all these events were going on, Guaido said that a large part of the Venezuelan government had escaped to Turkey. Now, that wasn't true. If Guaido
escaped to Turkey?
To escape to Turkey, absolutely. Now, if Guaido is prepared to say something like that, why should he hold back from burning a few trucks? It seems to me entirely possible that this thing has been that incident with the burning of the trucks was staged, and the reason it had been staged that we discussed before, because this whole thing was done for the cameras to create the image of this repressive and brutal government supposedly stopping humanitarian aid entering the country and setting it on fire so that it wouldn't be possible to feed the Venezuelan people. So I think it's entirely possible this thing was staged and that it was a false flag. Why not? I don't know that was the case, but I find that completely plausible.
Yeah. And let's wrap it up. You mentioned the Lima summit where Guaido will be attending. He will meet with Vice President Mike Pence. And let me read you a paragraph, an excerpt from Zero Hedge, and you can comment on it, Alexander. Guaido is to meet with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence at the summit where he will propose, I quote, he will propose formally to the international community that we should keep open all options for the liberation of our homeland, which is fighting and will continue to fight, according to a tweeted statement Saturday evening. Alexander, this is essentially Guaido asking the United States to attack his own country?
Absolutely. I mean, it is. I mean, of course, one should be clear about this. I mean, an attack can take many forms. It can take the form of ever greater sanctions. It can take the form of an air and land blockade, which I think is a distinct possibility. And eventually it could take the form of an invasion. I think we are a long way from an invasion. There was a very interesting article in The Economist, this British magazine, which normally supports all these interventionist wars, but which suggested that intervening militarily in Venezuela might be very difficult and very risky. But essentially, Guaido is calling for all of those things. I mean, those were his words. They're not my words. They're not your words. He is essentially talking about intervention in his own country. And I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, that's an absolutely appalling thing for someone who claims to lead a country or who says he wants to lead the country. It's important to stress he's not elected to lead Venezuela by anybody in Venezuela, but he claims that he wants to be the president of the country. And he wants to be put in to that position by outside powers. And to my mind, I would have thought many Venezuelans, including many people who I suspect don't like Maduro very much, when they see and hear that, are going to like Guaido even less.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable statement. And it just lends credence to the fact that all of this is not going to end well when you have the guy that's been the puppet that has been placed to destabilize Venezuela. And he's talking about, he wants to liberate, Venezuela for the good of the Venezuelan people, is actually calling for his own people to suffer at the hands of outside forces.
Absolutely. And as I said, I mean, it's a disgraceful game. I mean, it is a shocking game. It's very similar, by the way, to the sort of thing that happened in Iraq and in Syria, where you had all these exiles who it turned out in the end had very little support in Iraq and Syria, calling on the United States to intervene on their behalf so that they could take power, with American boots marching in front of them. And it seems to me that Guaido has exposed himself as exactly that sort of person.
Yeah, it reminds me, I forgot his name in Iraq, Chaloubi. He was in the
Ahmed Chalabi.
Chalabi. Guaido reminds me of guys like that who are calling for the own destruction of their country.
Exactly. That is exactly what it reminds me of. It's exactly what it is. There's no question about it. And now just add one thing. When people like Guaido talk about the international community, the majority of countries around the world continue to recognize the legitimate government of Venezuela, which is the government which represents Venezuela in the United Nations and which is led by President Maduro. They do not recognize Guaido, who, as I said, is self-appointed as president of Venezuela. When Guaido talks about the international community, he doesn't really mean the international community in terms of all the states of the world. He means the United States and its friends.
Yeah. Excellent point. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on that subscribe button down below and click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And visit the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. It really helps us out a lot. In the description box down below, you will find links to our PayPal and Patreon pages. Please donate to the Duran. That also helps us out a lot. And you can get a copy of this video in audio format. Go to Soundcloud and iTunes and follow us there. Don't forget, go to the Duran.com to see all the articles that Alexander is linking up to every day. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of Duran. Thank you once again. Until next time, everybody, take care.